Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'm joined by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He and I are going to have a conversation about some topics pertaining to the channel, and I'll go ahead and let Kevin get started.
Thanks, Tris. Glad to be here. A lot of
Glad to
good
have you.
content on the channel. We'll touch on some of those topics soon. I like to start off with kind of what's new or what's interesting for me since we last talked. And for me, something new and good is something very much not new. No matter how many artists I have come across over the years, it's always a great delight when I come across someone I'd overlooked, who is fascinating to listen to. And in this case, it was a band from the late 70s, early 80s called 2020, which I had never heard of in my entire life. For all the hundreds or thousands of artists I've come across, all the music I've dug into and come across pre-internet and during the internet age, I had somehow just completely overlooked this band. And they're a power pop band formed in the late 70s, only lasted until the early 80s, as was so often the case back then. Originated from Tulsa, formed in Hollywood, and had a brief flash of almost success. Made it as far as American Bandstand at one point. But the song I heard was a song called Yellow Pills, and it just completely hooked me in and compelled me immediately. We all know that feeling. It's a great feeling when you hear
Yeah.
something that just, grabs you and pulls you out of your seat. And that was it for me. So looked them up, heard as much as I could. There's a smattering of video on YouTube with them, but very much worth checking out.
I'd never heard of them either until you clued me in on it. And yeah, the outro, I think it was the outro of Yellow Pills that got me. I was like, oh, okay, there's, because that just added a whole new dimension to the song that I thought was really, really good. And yeah, the American Bandstand thing, one of them was actually from Brooklyn, too.
Hmm.
And I think that the drummer they picked up in LA, and I think that's about as
Yep.
much as I gleaned from all of my little internet research
Yeah,
about the
there's not
band.
much. Yeah.
And yeah, my two notes about the band were that they looked a little bit green and awkward on camera, especially on that American Bandstand appearance. And I think that maybe that might have contributed them not grabbing the mainstream. And also there's a little bit of derivative stuff in a couple parts of the songs where it's like, oh, like I know that's a Blondie hook or whatever, but everybody was stealing from everybody and everybody always does, so I can't hold that against them. But yeah, they're super cool.
Yeah, and great points. And that influence you mentioned, it's like we we almost kind of take that for granted that back then there were scenes. There were, sort of, scenes where styles developed and formed and cross-pollinated and things like that. And maybe you don't see that as much these days. Maybe TikTok is the scene or something, but maybe it'll become organic in its own way that it was back then. But yeah, they seem to be one of so many bands that maybe just wasn't quite ready for the MTV prime time in one
Yeah.
way or another. A lot of variables go into success, but I really enjoy and appreciate that rawness about them. You can see why they didn't turn into the darlings of the top 40 scene. There was a lot of competition in the style that they're working in, but it just felt real. It felt raw. It felt
Yeah.
like they really had something they were trying to put across, and they did it with a lot of sincerity. So it's great after all this time to keep digging, to keep to keep your antenna up, and there's good new stuff out there now that's interesting, but the history keeps providing us with some great inspiring material. So
It's always fun to find stuff that you missed. I always really enjoy that. And thank you so much for sharing that band with me. And I will share that band with everybody down in the description. I will have a link to the scant amount of material that exists about 2020. Probably just a link to a video, maybe a link to their wiki page. And you should check them out. So anyway, I just wanted to see if you have any questions or anything that you wanted to comment upon about recent content on the channel since the last time we spoke.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good topics to choose from, but I think the one I want to make sure doesn't get missed at this point, even though it's not new news anymore, is Steve Albini and his passing. I thought you did a very thoughtful video on him and his influence on you, and that's readily
Thank you.
apparent in the work ethic you have with your own music recording. I wanted to comment on him a little bit too, and the thought I keep coming back to when I reflect on him, it might sound kind of strange, but the thing that I think makes him so special in my mind, is that there's nothing special about him, and that sounds kind of strange, and I don't want it to come across the wrong way, so I'll explain. What it means is that the basis of his philosophy with the creative process, the technical process, the business process, everything he touched, seems to me just how things should be. It doesn't seem like some strange departure from how everything should work. It seems like, well, this is just how things should work. This is just how you should conduct business. This is just how you should go about recording and working with an artist and making music. It just seems like, why isn't everything this way? Why isn't everyone approaching it this way, creatively, technically, business wise? And so, what made him extraordinary was that he was doing all these things in an environment that was increasingly sort of pulling that apart and moving into being more calculated, more cynical, more money driven, more formulaic. And he could have easily ridden that train to a great deal of financial success. And formulaic music, as so many of his peers did. So what makes him extraordinary is that he held to those principles, and his example continues as an influence and inspiration to this day. But as far as what he did and how he did it, it's just like, to me, this is just how everything should be. It should be ordinary, it should be normal, it should be
Mm-hmm.
pervasive. And so he's left a great touchstone for everyone to return to just put those basic principles in action, which in many ways can simplify things for your creative process, your recording process, and just the way you interact with other people and do business with them. It's very clean, it's very straightforward. It carries a lot of what I think we need in these days, when digital is increasingly making everything arbitrary, in creative and artistic projects.
Yeah, you said it so well, and he was always just kind of stating the obvious in my mind. You kind of saw a twinkle in his eye when he would do a tutorial video for electrical audio or whatever, and he's kind of like looking at the camera and he's like, I shouldn't even have to tell you this, but I will.
Yes.
And it's true. I'll go to an example that I've always liked is that, he once broke down how you actually should mic a guitar cabinet in the studio. And he's like, well, the reason why mics are kissed up against speaker grills and they're on boom stands off to the side is a holdover from the live miking days of, early arena rock and things like that. It's like you couldn't have your mic stand in the way of the performer because they're going to kick it over. So, because a lot of guitar cabinet miking techniques were just developed in the live arena, not so much in the studio. A lot of times in the studio, I mean, you read about, the classic rock bands, they'd have a room mic, and then they might have a mic kind of close to the cabinet. But then people just started kind of carrying over the stage miking into the studio. And he's like, no, 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 no. Put your, dead center in front of the amp about, 12 to 16 inches. And he even says, until it sounds good, until you get a full picture of the amp. And I think that it's that kind of simplicity and that kind of just, common sense application of, sound principles is just so important. And I think that a lot of people just don't even think about those things. And he did. And then he kind of, turned it into its own science of simplicity, which is his great contribution. And I hope that, people like myself and others, continue to kind of carry that forward and keep passing it around and keep talking about it. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I think it's important to think about as far as getting authentic sounds in the room. I mean, that's what music is. It's my voice in this room. It's It's my guitar in this room, my drums, my bass. It's all, these sounds, and the sounds are made in the real world. And I think that a lot of people, just due to either, limitations in space or money, more and more, things are happening inside of a box, and it's not actually happening out in the world. And I think that we need to continue to make music in the world, so.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and that point about authenticity, I think, is something that whether you have the kind of setup where you can do things exactly as he did, or even if you're just completely working in a box, you can still take a step back and look at your process and where it has integrity, maybe where there are shortcuts, and where you're offloading the creative labor to a digital helper more than you need to, and just look at that message of authenticity, and that phrase that you had mentioned in the video, and now the sound in the room. I think that really condenses his attitude of being fully present in the moment, the creative moment, with the sound as it exists in this fleeting way, in this space. What is this space? Who is this artist? What is the sound we're working with? Drilling down to that full presence and mindfulness in the moment with the creative and technical process. Everyone can find a way to apply that principle to what they're doing. And the more of us who are concerned with authenticity and the authenticity of our artistic voice in what we put out, I think it just makes everything better. It kind of raises the standard quietly in a widespread way that I think is much healthier at the end of the day for the artist, the listener, the world. And so it's simple principles in one way, but incredibly important in others.
It's profound in its own way, as all great simple things are, because they're usually true and they're usually profound. Well, anyway, I wanted to, for our main topic, I wanted to talk about, we could go into just like prices, things are, prices are creeping up all over the place for everything. But in the music gear world, it seems particularly, I don't necessarily buy that it's all inflation, or that if you're going to get something that's made stateside, it has to cost 10 times the amount that something overseas does. I understand all the arguments for and against that. I think that also dovetailing, though, into the idea of prices, we could talk a little bit about the fact that the marketplace is in a chaotic state right now, being that, one of the, landmark retailers in music in America is closing its doors. Sam Ash right now is blowing things out. By the time this video is published, things should probably be about getting down to that range where it's like, oh yeah, that's going to be a good buy. They're pretty early on in the process of liquidating. You had mentioned to me about Guitar Center, and I read the same and heard the same stuff that you did about them wanting to up their game and getting back into not having a bunch of budget starter packs all over the showroom floor, but having more high-end stuff. And then, there's a lot of people too who are talking about the disappearance of the middle. And I think the middle is too expensive to begin with. It's like, oh, the mid-range of gear, let's just take guitars for example, starting at $1,000, ending at $2,000, in that range, that mid-range price, which, I don't like spending more than $400 for a guitar myself, but that's just me because I mod the crap out of them. But anyway, and then everything's moving into this $3,000 and up range, or the $300 and down range. There's some interesting things going on, and I just wanted to kind of get your opinion. I'll start with one bullet point though, and then you can respond to it. How much of this do you think is actually a product of natural as it can be in the capitalist system, of natural market forces, or do you see cash grabbing happening in the market?
I think, yeah, you really encapsulated a lot there. I think that it's hard to really distill it down to one variable. I think all these things play a part. As you said, I think it's more than just inflation. And with something like musical instruments, they're really sensitive to things like perceived scarcity and awareness driving demand. But it does seem like it's distorted in from what it used to be. I think regardless of what the variable is, I think any of us who've been in taking part in the process of buying and selling instruments or musical equipment over the long haul, the experience of it is a lot different now. It's not what it was before, and it's much less accessible now, both literally in terms of physical access to direct physical access to instruments with the retail model so much in flux, and the music store model seemingly less viable in so many places, but then also the prices themselves and how different it is. I was doing a little bit of looking at numbers, and I remember back in the mid '90s when you could go to a decent music store in a reasonably large town and see a rack of 1970s Fender basses. I could buy as many $600 1970s Fender Precisions as I wanted back then. It was just which one you liked the most. It,
You're not
according to
doing that
inflation
now.
calculators, well, yeah, according to inflation calculators, that would be about double the price now. It would be around $1,200 would be the market value of that, and
But
the actual
that's
market
not what
value
they're
is more
going
than
for.
double that.
Oh
And
yeah,
so
they're like $4,000.
yeah. Now, and
You
as
know.
I said, some of that has to do with the change in perception of their value. And it's not like every instrument has increased that much in value, but it's a distortion of the market that has made things less accessible and reduced the number of options that are available. And it would be one thing if that were the case, but the low end guitars were still $300, but now the Chinese made Epiphones and Squires are creeping up into that 1,000 plus range, and so that what was the accessible has now become the upper middle class of the instrument world, and what was the middle class or the lower middle class is now priced out of almost everyone's availability, and the only place to even find them now is going to Reverb, and it feels to me like it used to be a situation where there was more variability in demand and awareness, in desirability, but now it's like everything is having its value increased to the maximum possible. You look at prices now and it's like this is definitely beyond what this guitar is really worth.
Yeah.
But it will sit there on Reverb for 6 months and eventually somebody will buy it at that price. And it's just participating in that dynamic is a lot different now, whatever the variables are that contribute to it.
To be totally fair, though, the base model, like Classic Vibe and stuff like that, the base model Squires, and then the like Epiphone, no special anythings are still they still float around
Yes.
$500 to $700. They're still
Yeah.
floating in there. They're
Still
not quite at a
exists.
grand yet, but a lot more of their product lines are above a grand now because they're doing more specialty stuff, And I think that another point to bring, I think the best way to talk about value and perceived price is that, let's I love trashing on Epiphone and Gibson. We'll start with them. They are putting out products now that are pushing into the high end of the mid-priced range, and they're still not using Indian rosewood on the fingerboards, and they are being made in the same factory where an Epiphone $399 starter pack is being made. So if you're using the same factory and the same materials and then charging 3 times as much for an instrument, yeah, there may be a couple more, a little bit more hours put in as far as handwork. But when the materials in the factory are the same, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, I'm going to pay $1,800 for a guitar that I know was made in the same factory as, akin to where I bought my Epiphone Les Paul for $299 20 years ago. If it's the same place and the same materials, why am I going to pay that much money? And then in the Fender world, it's kind of the same thing, where we're starting to see stuff that is coming out of Indonesia and it's pushing into the Mexican, like now the Made in Mexico thing is beginning to kind of fall apart on Fender, and so it's going to be custom shop in Indonesia soon, and so why would you pay $2,000 for a Mexican made instrument when that's not that far away from getting an American made one. So yeah, I think there's a lot of market distortion, and I think that I feel like the companies, like you kind of alluded to, they're pushing to see where, how much can we ask and they'll still buy it, and then they're like, well, since we're not in that deep anyway as far as our costs, we can always discount it later. That's the feeling I get, is like they're just out there throwing the risk, and they're kind of screwing over retailers by doing that, because then the retailers, if they have extra stock left over because people are unwilling to pay those prices, they're going to have to eat that, by discounting them and trying to blow them out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I
I think
feel
you're
like,
right. I think, with those examples of guitars basically being made the same way in the same factories and sold for vastly different prices, it feels like that class of the classic vibe type instruments that are, sub 500 or whatever, are kind of the carrying the torch for, the next generation of people who are trying to get into guitars. But I do wonder about companies saying, if I can make $1,000 Epiphone, why would I make a $500 one? Will they, will how much will they force the issue and do what you just described and say, we're just going to try to sell everything for $1,000 now and see if it sticks. And if it does, then we've changed the value equation away from what actually goes into this,
yeah.
and how much we can squeeze out of it.
What's going to end up happening with Epiphone is that if you want a sub $500 Epiphone, it's going to be a slab body. It's not going to have binding, and it's going to have the worst electronics and the worst hardware on it, like the way those old Epiphone specials, from the 90s were. Those were $139 all day at Musician's Friend, and they were trash. But then Epi came back in the late 90s and early 2000s and started putting out, these really well-made Korean, I'm all about the made in Korea Epiphone stuff from the late 90s and early 2000s. They had something to prove. They're like, we want to bring this brand back. Mm-hmm. But we're going to do it with overseas labor and with really tight quality control. And those instruments are exceptional. And then now I feel like it's going to go, okay, well, we're going to charge you, 3 or 4 times what we used to do, and for, a carved top with decent wood and good electronics, Les Paul, they are going to charge $1,000 for those soon, I'm guessing, across the board. And if you want a cheap Epi, you're going to have a slab guitar, and it's, that's not, and I don't know, maybe also I'm an old man that's pining for the old ways or something, or maybe COVID did transform everything, or maybe I'm out of touch. But I'm seeing a lot of YouTubers now just accepting these prices. A lot of it's because, well, they're being paid to do so, But a lot of it, too, I think, is this reticence where it's just like, well, that's just the way it is. And I'm kind of unwilling to accept that yet. I think that, and the cool thing is that if Epiphone changes over to the Gibson headstock and everybody wants those, the market will be flooded, Reverb will be flooded with these old Epis that have the undesirable headstock. Grab those guitars, because they'll be cheap and they'll be better than the ones that'll end up having these open book headstocks, I think in the long term. I think that someday, I think if I live long enough, we're going to see the old Epiphone headstock become collectible.
Oh, I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen the crack. We've already seen the crackle finish come back as a deluxe,
Oh, sure.
high-end, special option, and those are the things we used to laugh at on the walls of music stores.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, there is hope. I think as far as the consumer goes, it's not very consumer friendly in some ways at the moment, but hopefully forces like this, and hopefully music retail will find a way to navigate through this, because it still creates the capacity to come across kind of a hidden gem.
Oh,
And
sure.
we used to have a music go around in my town here that closed. It was a great place to go for those sort of overlooked finds where you could see the potential in something, and still get it as a good price. And if
Yeah.
you knew some of the things that you just talked about, like what was made well and when was it made, it that allowed you to really navigate and find the good values. And now online, it seems like there's a lot of that's being wiped out. But the local retail, when it's done well and done right, can really be a portal into all of this. And it feels like there's a resurgence in guitar interest and, among younger people these days compared to, maybe 10 years ago. And so I hope that they will have the necessary standards to kind of help drive this in the right direction.
Well, the good thing about the online universe is you can get a lot of education. So that my advice to anybody who's, and these are like friends here in town or, people getting back into music or younger people, my advice always is just educate yourself. If you have a basic idea of what you want, then find out everything you can about it. If it's a Stratocaster, a Les Paul, a keyboard, whatever, research, and then scour. And then half the time I end up finding something in a store hiding here in town, sometimes. And we have a music go round and I really enjoy it. I think that it's a great store, but they're definitely trying to keep up with the Joneses, because I've noticed that more and more they're stocking there's a lot of Gibson in there and a lot of American made Fender in there, and their prices are the right prices. And it's like, I don't know if I can go into a store like that and drop $2,500 on a guitar. It's the hidden gem thing has been over for a long time, but if you dig hard enough, you can still find them for sure.
Yeah, and
I'm
to
always
tie it
looking
back
around.
to the ethos of your channel here, it really reinforces the importance of being able to do some degree of DIY. You don't have to be completely gutting and turning over everything in an instrument. If you can, that's great. But any degree of control you have over the process of making an instrument usable, setting action, adjusting the neck, replacing a part or two, working on the frets, all of those things can allow you to make values much better
Yes.
than you would otherwise, because there's still a lot of barrier for a lot of consumers where if it's not right immediately off the wall, then it just isn't right. Whereas if you have the ability to get it from point A to point B, you can still sort of force the value equation on guitars that other people might overlook. So to circle back to what, the message, one of the messages of this channel is, it's like that's an empowering thing. There are a lot of things that we're helpless with in the market and costs and so forth, but you can still make more values than exist right now through a little bit of that DIY learning and practice.
Educating yourself. That's the whole thing, both in what to purchase and knowing what you can do to it to fix it. And because there are still a lot of viable platforms out there, just sitting there, just waiting to be, dusted off and fixed up. They are out there. And like I said, it's unreasonable of me, but I won't pay more than $400 for a guitar. And all the guitars I've acquired recently have all been at that 400 or below price point, and they've all turned out pretty darn well for me so far. So, I'm going to keep hunting for that stuff and trying to encourage people to do the same. So,
Yeah, I
well,
think any lawyer or dentist who buys the $7,000 signature model new off the rack, their perspective would be utterly changed if they walked into the studio here behind you and played your instruments and realized, just what is possible to do with a little bit of elbow grease. So.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. That's a high compliment. Well, I think that at this point we should wrap it up. We will be revisiting this topic over and over again in ways and in bits and pieces as the price issues continue and as music retail continues to try to find its feet. I would like to thank Kevin for joining me for this conversation. And go ahead, and if you've watched to this point, I would hope that you've subscribed. And if you haven't, please do. Likes and shares are appreciated, and comments. I love the comment section. Keep them coming. And we will see you next time with another conversation with Kevin. Take care.